Welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'm David Levi Strauss, the chair of the MFA program in art criticism and writing here at the School of Visual Arts. One of the pleasures of organizing this lecture series is that I sometimes get to invite one of my heroes to talk. Lucy Lippard has been a hero of mine for a long time. She's a writer first, who has managed to write about art and politics in many different ways over the past half-decade. Rather than accepting the terms of the art world, she has made her own way and found a way to keep doing it, to keep publishing and making it public on her terms in collaboration with other artists, activists, and writers. She's a radical who has survived. She has probably done more than any other writer to democratize the making of art and its reception in our time, and she continues to ask crucial questions about the relationship between art and life, artist and audience, and aesthetics and politics. Lucy Lippard is a writer, activist, feminist, curator, and author of more than 20 books on contemporary art and cultural criticism. Some of my personal favorites are the books Changing, Essays in Art Criticism, 1971, 6 Years, The Dematerialization of the Art Object, 1973, From the Center, Feminist Essays on Women's Art, 1976, I See, You Mean, a Novel, 1979, Overlay, Contemporary Art and the Art of Prehistory, 1983, Get the Message, A Decade of Art for Social Change, 1984, Mixed Blessings, New Art in a Multicultural America, 1990, The Lure of the Local, 1997, and On the Beaten Track, Tourism, Art, and Place. She's also curated some 50 exhibitions in the US, Europe, and Latin America. Lippard was born in New York City, earned a master's degree in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts, and began her work as an art critic here. But for the last nearly 20 years, she has lived off the grid in Galisteo, New Mexico, where she edits her community newsletter and participates in local planning and watershed restoration. In the introduction to The Lure of the Local, she wrote, "Place for me is the locus of desire. Places have influenced my life as much as, perhaps more than people. I fall for or into places faster and less conditionally than I do for people. I can drive through a landscape and vividly picture myself in that disintegrating mining cabin, that saltwater farm, that little porched house in the barrio. My taste runs to humble dwellings nestled in cozy spaces or vulnerable in vast spaces." Tonight she will examine the role and effectiveness of photography in generating responsibility for place. It is my great pleasure to welcome Lucy Lippard.
And before I start, it was suggested to me that we think after the talk, hopefully, a little bit about what we should do about Ai Weiwei, who's been detained by the Chinese government. I haven't got any immediate suggestions, but start thinking. This is by Robert Adams. It's called The Path of Development in Denver, Agricultural Landscape Being Swallowed Up by Housing Developments. The title of this lecture, Ghosts, the Daily News and Prophecy, is thanks to Robert Adams, whose serial approach to landscape photography gave it a new social life. In 1980, he wrote, "What a landscape photographer traditionally tries to do is show what is past, present, and future at once. You want ghosts and the daily news and prophecy. It's presumptuous and ridiculous. You fail all the time." This is by Wanda Hammerbeck. It's called Living Beyond Limits. It speaks for itself. We have a lot of golf courses in the desert where I live. She sort of brings these messages from the landscape in her work. So anyway, I know this lecture series is supposed to be about criticism, but I have to admit that criticism per se has interested me very little. My own work in the last 20 years or more has wandered further and further afield from anything that can be called art criticism, and I always hated the term anyway, since I've been more of an advocate than a critic, and everything I know about art I learned from artists. When I'm asked about my methodology, I have to laugh. It's simply one thing leads to another. That and a collage aesthetic I initially found in Dada and Surrealism and rediscovered through feminism. And one more disavowal, sometimes I get called a theorist. I love ideas, but I've always seen theories as a kind of hardening of the arteries when ideas get too contained and lose their flexibility. So anyway, in this case, critical photography is going to stand in for critical writing. Similarly, most of these photographers are not challenging the medium of photography so much as they're dealing with land use issues. Yet there's an essential disjunction. When their works are shown, they look like art objects, not activism. It's by Gary Chaldella. It houses an oil storage in Calumet, the Calumet region of Indiana and Illinois, where he was raised. And so much has been written on the nature and agency of photography, representation, visual culture, that it's hard to imagine anything new under the sun. So I decided to just sit with my present moment and see what came into view. I often offer up the title, Imagine Being Here Now, when I have no idea what I'm going to talk about, but also because I enjoy the paradox. My personal focus on photography is because of the way it can illuminate places. Why would we have to imagine a place if we're right here now? Because we're always doing it. Because every day we imagine and then live a version of our histories or newer stories, which we then disseminate through friends and family, photography being a major vehicle for this journey. This is by Bremner Bretternitz, who is from New York. It's Windy Mountain Gorilla. It's her daughter and dioramas, and this is a whole series, and it's about the loss of nature, the loss of, and it's called, I think, Reimagining Eden, the loss of childhood, sense of wonder, the enchantment of nature, that kind of thing. I think it's a wonderful image. I'm not going to discuss in detail the photographs I'm showing, as you see, and I'm providing a kind of unsatisfactory monovision of these photographers' work, as it just sort of parallels my narrative. You can think of the pictures in context of social information that might influence political decisions. Despite Adam's doubts, I've found that a concentration on place, which can't easily be conflated with land or site or landscape, brings everything into focus, including politics. Ultimately, words and images offer ways to integrate one's own imaginings of life into those of a polity. The relationship of imagination to reality and action is crucial, especially for artists and writers who specialize in acting in the gap between the two, or between art and life, or what's sometimes called public practice. If we lean too far on the imagination side, we risk falling off the edge into wishful thinking, like visualize world peace, then falling back on the couch. Lean too far on the reality side, and we risk getting stuck in the status quo. The late Joe Diehl, in his last book, West and West, which this is from, talked about his intention to reimagine what lies beneath the surveyor's grid in the open and relatively featureless spaces of the Missouri Plateau in North Dakota. If the square employed in surveys of public lands, he said, could function like a telescope, framing smaller and smaller sections of the plains down to a transect, it can also be used as a window, equilaterally divided by the horizon, that begins with a finite section of the earth and sky and restores them in the imagination to the vastness that now exists only as an idea. The landscape that's contained within the perfect symmetry of the square implies infinity. The end of that quote. Like many contemporary photographers, Diehl can make what first looks like nothing look like something we should have noticed. Unlike the kind of work described by Bill Fox as just an advertisement for nature. My heightened interest in photography admittedly arrived kind of late in my writing life. I was guided by my involvement in the 60s with conceptual art and its kind of snapshot approach to the medium. Heather Diak has written that conceptual artists were interested in exploring photography's ability to level all information onto a singular surface, while simultaneously extolling the sameness that could frame all difference. This image is one of a series by Doug Hubler in which he went to Central Park and pointed his camera every time he heard a bird sing. You see the place, but you don't hear the birds, though I always feel like I do. That's imagining being here now. This is one of Bob Smithson's Passaic monuments with pontoons and pumping deck. As has often been said, photography is a presence based on absence. Carl Andre, whose horizontal focus helped redefine the sculptural axis in the 60s, said, "A thing is a whole in a thing it is not." In his classic 1967 photo essay, A Tour of the Monuments of Passaic, New Jersey, Robert Smithson talked about how full of holes prosaic Passaic seemed in contrast to solid New York. Deal's quote on landscape implying infinity, incidentally, is totally contrary to Smithson's insistence on finity. We actually used to have fights about this, which has had much more traction in current theory over the last few decades. Infinity, like utopia, is considered insufficiently down to earth. I'm up for both of them anyway. Interestingly, Smithson's writings have probably had more influence on photography than on sculpture and land art, which were his own preoccupations. In fact, his approach to photography was so casual, he told me to take all the pictures in his Seattle Horizons piece for a 1969 show I curated there, because he couldn't be there to do it himself. And it wasn't easy because it was supposed to be flat, and there's nothing flat in Seattle. Simultaneously involved in places and self-consciously removed from them, Smithson promoted a sense of suburban unreality, writing with typical ambivalence that even on sight he felt he was photographing a photograph. This apparently casual aesthetic became not only a landmark in conceptual art, but a prototype for the new topographics in the mid-70s. In those days, there was so little common ground between so-called art photographs and conceptual artists that this seems to have really gone unnoticed for some reason. But the fractured vision of 21st century photography does have its roots in those exciting days, for all its contemporary slickness that would have been anathema to conceptualists in the 60s and 70s. These are by Aviva Romani, who's in the audience tonight. Since the 1960s, place has become a self-conscious rather than organic concept. The sort of woozy notion of the spirit of place has given way to cultural geography. But of course, each place is thousands of places, each one of which can be captured by a photographer. A real sense of place is a virtual immersion that's also temporal and embraces daily change. It depends both on lived experience and memory and on topographical, even infrastructural intimacy, not to mention acquired knowledge on the ground and in the books. J.B. Jackson, the extraordinary essayist and cultural geographer, wrote that no landscape, vernacular or otherwise, can be comprehended unless we perceive it as an organization of space, unless we ask ourselves who owns and uses those spaces, how they were created, and how they change. While specificity and local knowledge provide the base in the process of following the vortex of land and lives, a tantalizing liminal space has opened up between disciplines, between the arts, photography, geography, history, archaeology, sociology. Space occupied, for instance, by Trevor Paglen, who follows the night skies and the black sites of governmental secrecy. This is his salt pit, a secret prison in Kabul, Afghanistan. The prime mover of this direction is Matthew Coolidge and the Center for Land Use Interpretation, LA-based group. My favorite example of a new conceptual art, or maybe not art. It reimagines landscape and place within a broader, more social and analytical framework dedicated to, quote, the increase and diffusion of information about how the world's lands are appropriated, utilized, and perceived. For example, Dauphin Island in the Gulf of Mexico, whose stubborn residents rebuild higher and higher on stilts in the face of increasingly powerful storms. The sly and apparently apolitical blandness with which Kluwe's work is presented belies the hard information it offers about militarism, corporate destruction, roads barging through wilderness, deleted communities, and other sites hidden in plain sight, because no one has wandered down those roads with the attentiveness they deserve, is what Kluwe says. The late writer Alexander Wilson could have been referring to Kluwe when he said, "We tour the disparate surfaces of everyday life as a way of reintegrating a fragmented world." Kluwe trumps cynicism, working on a fine line between art and everything else, specializing in the not particularly special, seeing the contemporary landscape itself as a museum. Kluwe's staff also warns that too much information can be as obfuscating as too little. This is by Terry Evans. It's a bombing range. I have no idea why it's in a Star of David, although as a Palestinian ally, I could make up some ideas. Both Paglen and Kluwe identify themselves as experimental geographers, the title of a show curated by Nato Thompson a couple of years ago, must have been in New York. Such sites are, well, no, it was also in Albuquerque. Such sites are those described by photographer Peter Goen as human nature, all one word, or altered landscapes, which was the title of a show and collection at the Nevada Museum of Art. Of course, almost every landscape we know has been altered one way or another, usually by humankind over the ages. The term is understood to mean that the landscape has been changed relatively recently and not necessarily for the better. For some, any change is bad change. Landscapes are spoiled as soon as they're altered, by forces beyond our control. Hubris leads us to believe that we should decide what changes and how, as though agreement were possible in this polyphonic world. Some, for instance, would cheer on the destruction of a lesser creature's habitat to build a playground. Prairie dogs would be those creatures where I live. Others would comprehend the long-term environmental connections between a little rodent that aerates the earth and the children who would play there. As we discover the social and ecological subtleties of alteration, we begin to understand the nuances and the interconnections between what we call nature and what we call human, which is, of course, merely another branch of nature, though we've done everything we can to separate ourselves from those parts we think we can dominate. This is by Debbie Fleming Caffery, the Gulf oil spill, oil beams, oiled shore, and so forth. Photographers catch moments in this process, give us reference points, something to hang on to, make us aware that history is continuous, moving across borders from yesterday through today to tomorrow. The more striking the image, the more we're likely to remember it. But some of the most meaningful are subtler, taking longer to absorb. And memory is crucial to the social study of land and its uses. Though we've long passed the moment when photographs were seen as truth, they still participate in the presentation of multiple truths, which could also be a definition of collective memory, which in turn calls for a diversity of individual viewers. Photography might be described as the thing that fills the hole between us and other things or people. It offers up an imaginary history that has its roots in the real, but we can never tell what's real and what isn't, especially if the image is maliciously or ignorantly miscaptioned, as happens all too often in photojournalism. These are two images by Sharon Stewart from a series she did in El Cerrito, New Mexico, about the spring cleaning of the acequias, which are irrigation ditches, a ritual for the small towns in northern New Mexico. Collaboration is the social extension of collage, another product of modernity's fragmentation. Good documentary photography is a collaboration with events or places and sometimes the residents. It records, although photographing, respecting, or exploiting people is usually a lot more problematic than shooting landscape. Sometimes collaboration's possible with those people who are of the place for generations, like here, or whose lives are deeply intertwined with it, which makes the whole landscape photography enterprise a lot more complicated and more layered. In his new book, Working the Line, David Taylor includes the migrants and border control agents for whom place is a matter of life and death. Among other things, he shows us the strange presences of the Mexican-US border monuments, lonely sentinels in a contested landscape, or graffitied accomplices to the misbegotten border wall. Landscape photography is often so generalized that without the aid of captions, we'd have no idea what part of the world we were seeing, where it is, how it got that way. I can find it frustrating to look at an image that's untitled, uncaptioned, displaced, that's been deprived of its specificity by aesthetic intentions, because its maker has decided that specificity injures its status. But obviously context and content are crucial. An uprooted photograph can be floated in any direction, which isn't always a disadvantage. Sometimes the photographer is more involved in formal values, as in these images, which he calls convergences, by Ethan Ryman. I couldn't resist a little nepotism. That one is in, I think, Governor's Island. And this one is a museum in Berlin, Museum Convergence. He conceives of these pieces as more object than image, yet specificity is still paramount. Detail can also equal place, even if that was not the intention with these. Provocative in another way are mysterious images of places where something happened, in which the ambiguity is swept away only by the captions, which provide a context the images can't offer on their own, like Carol Gallagher's dark and moving pictures from her 1980s book, American Ground Zero, of the homes of downwinders radiated by the Nevada test site. This is a deserted schoolyard in Amargosa Valley, 10 miles south of the test site. Uprooted images can also become real-life collages, like the colonial remains of the German manager's house in Lüderitz, Namibia, Africa, by Andrea Robbins and Max Bescher, who specialize in what they call transportation of place. People, places, costumes that are simultaneously very specific and seriously out of context. They explore those places where people's illusions have replaced their realities. Here, both history and memory are skewed, but not inaccurate. They illuminate J.B. Jackson's description of American history reflected in land use as a dramatic discontinuity instead of the smooth timeline we get in textbooks. But I'm also intrigued by what Gertrude Stein calls the continuous present. Time as space, flowing across terrain unmarked by boundaries, so that people don't feel separated from but are integrated into the place. This is by John Gannis. It's the national seashore in Pensacola, Florida during the BP oil spill. Los Angeles artist Amanda Ross Ho said in an interview a year or so ago, "We live and act in the present, and yet it is the hardest moment to describe. The present is our ongoing, ever-changing moment of origin, a collage of everything, a multifaceted jewel made up of memory, feeling, thinking, and whatever you're looking at." I love that quote. That's the end of it. Similarly, I like to think of a photograph as a field rather than an artifact, suggesting sequence, layers, and periphery. So every image we see, no matter how trivial or unaesthetic or temporary and political, like the Yes Men's correction of a Chevron ad campaign after the spill, is a clue to the whole span of time between when it was taken and when we're looking at it. Photography is, in a way, the original ready-made. It exists in the moment it was taken and in the moment it was perused. It is perused. As Jan Tumler has written, the photographic process is subtractive. It's literally a cut into the space-time continuum. It's a minute, fragmentary part of an infinitely greater whole, the world that is shaved off at its edges. Photographers talk a lot about edges. The best images present not just what we see, they're also haunted by the invisible layers and spaces the photographer has managed to imply. This is by Shubhankar Banerjee. It's a very large print of aerial view of caribou in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And then the other part of that, also by Shubhankar, is the traditional and sustainable use of wildlife by the Gwich'in indigenous people who live there. Places and photographs of places are the bearers of history, personal, regional, and global change. This need not mean a focus on the past. History is constantly being created and recreated, and recent history may mean more to residents than ancient history, obviously. Artists confronted with a specific landscape are conventionally invited to impose their own visions upon it, an overlay of personal or conceptual preference. Canadian Sylvie Redmond did exactly that in her Petite Histoire des Ombres series, superimposing her own visions on 19th century paintings, simultaneously picturing history and dispelling specificity, a kind of obfuscating rephotography. But most existing places demand to be considered for themselves, not as a blank slate, but as an already evolved image with a history that can be altered or transformed, but never entirely erased. Landscape is almost by definition context. I know I keep harping on this, time and space. Rephotography, the attempted replication of historic or older images of the same site, raises some interesting questions on that level, questions that are sometimes more interesting than the photographs themselves. Rephotography can be the vehicle for reimagining not only a place, but the time that defines the invisible interim between the original and the retake. I'm into this at the moment because I'm currently working with Peter Goen, who did this right-hand one, on a rephotography project called Time and Time Again, which is concerned with the way two Native American archaeological sites in the West are interpreted and preserved, Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. This is Chaco. Rephotographers can stand in a landscape and find the same hill still there in the background, even though it may now be hidden by trees or buildings. But the where can be easier to fathom than the when. It takes a lot more research or imagination to figure out how much time has elapsed between images and how to express that interim in the images. The answer to Kevin Lynch's classic question, what time is this place, would have to be both then and now. Another way of looking at time and space is a project by Christos Dikaiakos, who has been photographing the unstable nature and exhausted landscape of the False Creek area of Vancouver since the 1960s, noting that nothing can be taken as permanent. The foreground or background in my pictures can attest to that. This is an image of a squatters' camp on the edge of the construction of last year's Olympic site. And it's rife with ironies, as what he says is the underclass of drifters appears adjacent to the architectural skyline of the narcissistic city. This is by Juliet Sinajani, Diné Navajo artist. The curators of a, speaks for itself, the curators of a provocative exhibition called the Potosi Principle at the Reina Sofia in Madrid tried to counter what they call the linear evolutionist narrative of enlightened modernity by connecting past and present as a temporal loop in a Baroque game of mirrors. They also note that the institution of art can easily act in complicity with a new global slavery, the commercialization of subjective viewpoints. This raises the ethical balancing act that all of the arts, including photography, must perform today. This is by Amy Stein, called Coyote, and I thought this was just sort of an amazing image. Then I found that the coyote was stuffed. But then somebody told me that she sometimes tells people it's stuffed and sometimes she says it isn't stuffed, so whatever. Once photography was divested of its truth status, it was opened up to that ambiguity that many consider to be the heart of meaningful art, even though it all too often devolves into self-indulgent incomprehensibility. Contemporary photography, by definition, is aligned simultaneously with reality and creativity, the two forever sparring. Walker Evans once said, art is never a document, but it can adopt that style. It's tricky to endow documents with too much aesthetic interest, quirky angles, odd subject matter, subtle color, and so forth. This is by Peter Goen again, Nevada test site. Sometimes I want to challenge photographers to give up their relatively recent status as high artists and return to photography's freer, more open, more functional, and populist legacy. The ways in which photography has pushed the boundaries of representation in all directions has also allowed it to infiltrate every aspect of the high art world. But sometimes I wonder, what good did it do to be taken into the art world in the last 30 or 40 years? Certainly it's a no less commercial venue than what's called commercial photography. As the Bruce High Quality Foundation has noted, what happens in the art world stays in the art world. I should think that photographers who enjoy far more and further ranging possibilities than the makers of painting, sculpture, video, or installations do might feel claustrophobic when welcomed into and then confined in the art world. This is by John Willis. It's Dogs on the Pine Ridge Reservation around the Wounded Knee Monument, from a recent book of his about Pine Ridge. This may be just a personal hobby horse, of course. I've spent most of my life advocating for art that escapes the art world and elopes with life. I'm still looking for art forms that are buried in social energies not yet recognized as art. That's a line I wrote in the 70s. It's another 60s thing, anyway. Given the public indifference to art and the stigma of corporate and boutique classes' attraction to art for status or whatever, this might be better accomplished by more slippery, subversive means to justify that end, like the many young collectives that are springing up all over the world to act in areas like urban planning and agriculture. Art, as somebody said, with a capitalist A, has exponentially expanded over the last 20 years, paralleling the national obesity epidemic. I found myself telling a young artist, it's a powerful image, but it probably should be bigger, in part to illuminate through enlargement, in part merely to attract attention in a highly competitive art world arena. I've avoided getting into the issues of artificial and virtual sites, the way that cyberspace provides instant historical memory, mixing past and present in unexpected ways while at the same time promoting cultural amnesia. I'm hardly equipped to deal with it. I can barely wrap my head around all directions suggested by a single link, and I'm still wrestling with the dislike of artists' websites, sorry. I'm at least aware that we're immersed in a veritable tsunami of decontextualized cultural knowledge almost every minute of our waking lives. and a lot of it's increasingly visual. The dictionary definition of virtual includes achieving the feeling of reality. Tourism, for instance, could be called a virtual experience because it's so often mediated by illusion and takes real work to make it real. If computer screens mediate between the real and the virtual, that's also one of photography's roles. David Levi Strauss has quoted painter Leon Golub saying that he used photographs as sources because he was trying to make some connection to what's going on in the world, to make some kind of contact. So he used the instruments that our modern world offers, photography, film, and computers. This piece is by Chris Jordan, and here is a detail. It's called Denali, and this is a detail of it. It's 24,000 logos of GMC Yukon Denali. 6 weeks of sales of that SUV in 2004, and that's the detail that makes up that whole other image. But I'm not sure what all this means for landscape where context is so important. What effect have Google Earth and GPS and GIS and LIDAR and LIDAR and so forth had on new landscape photography? I don't know. I'd love to know. There must be works out there I don't know about that are confronting these enormous changes in the way we see, changes that make the distancing of objective documentary photography seem downright touchy-feely. As cultural workers, how do we respond? What's to be literally made of these changes? Are they only good for marketing? Do they make conventional art irrelevant? There have been several periods in my life when I thought art had a chance to reach what we've always earnestly called a broader audience. Well, now we've got it, and it seems possible that art could drown in it. I'm going to end by discussing in a little more detail one project that raises some of these issues. This project I'm talking about is the Legacy Project. It's a collaborative work focusing on the ongoing documentation of the remains of a 4,700-acre former Marine Corps Air Station at El Toro, California. And there's 6 photographers: Mark Chamberlain, Jacques Garnier, Robert Johnson, Doug McCullough, Clayton Spada, and the late Jerry Birchfield. And they've produced 90,000 photographs and counting. Some are intended as straight documentation of the 20-mile perimeter, and others are individual artist views of the place and its artifacts. The Legacy Project would fit into Kluwe's database, although perhaps ignoring Kluwe's warnings about overkill. It provides so much context that it remythologizes the place with multiple, if not infinite, captions. With each bit of information, another layer of this photographic sea becomes perceptible, recalling the map described in a story by Jorge Luis Borges, a map so obsessively detailed that it eventually covers the entire territory that it maps. Well, you saw this gray thing at the left. that was an aerial view of El Toro. The gray thing at the left is what I'm just about to talk about. At the center of this amazing amount of activity is the great picture, which is one of those crazy ideas that occur to artists, an immense gray, somewhat blurry image, 25 by 100 feet. Evidence first and foremost of risks taken and overcome. It's the offspring of a camera obscura or pinhole process. Its womb is a jet hangar. The apocalyptic fields of dark sky and light foreground are an evocative inversion, betraying the picture's origins as an upside-down photographic negative. There's a 19th century aura to its ghostly emanations. So then you'd see this picture of a fence with green behind it. It's flashed by you.
It'll come back.
Which are one of the rather banal, and I think intentionally banal, perimeter photos taken tellingly around the outside of the airbase. The inside, which is still out of bounds to the public, is where the great picture lurks, a backdrop for unrevealed drama not quite gone, but in the process of disappearing into the distance. The great picture conceals or contains many histories, from indigenous occupation to Spanish and Mexican ranching, to Anglo farming, to a World War II military base, to the great park that it's now becoming, offering a quick lesson in Western settlement and capital investment. This is by Doug McCullough, one of the collaborators. The Legacy Project can ultimately be seen as a sort of meditation on obsolescence, the fate of land altered for defense, rejected by power and capital, and then saved by the magic wand of civic improvement to become this vast public park, the site of leisure and enjoyment. El Toro stands in for our multiple national sacrifice sites, including Los Alamos, the Nevada test site, which has already poisoned 1.6 trillion gallons of water, and the Rocky Mountain Arsenal in Denver, which is now an unlikely wildlife refuge. This photo is by Dory Klein. Here we have to ask if these lethal places are being normalized by photography. Any single photographic strategy is hard put to outline the deeper causes and the repercussions in such a shifting landscape. Now, even more than ever, images contain lessons in local and global power relations. Most of us live our lives in similarly layered landscapes, and we're often totally ignorant of the histories buried beneath our daily activities. I like to think in terms of ripple effects, content that begins from a center, a very specific place, a deep map, what Joe Deal was talking about. And then with really consciously lived experience, it moves out from there in ripples to deal with land use, land rights, the politics of property, the relics of colonialism, climate change, ongoing national expansionism, and so forth. It's by Beverly Natus. It's part of a series called Reframing Eden, part of an eco-project on Vashon Island in Washington, from dump to garden, collecting stories from local farmers and gardeners and so forth. So one way of learning where we are in this time of tremendous anxiety and overload is to follow these ripples, their impacts on our center and vice versa, and where other rings intercede to affect us and the environment and so forth. If artists, and especially photographers, frame what we see and how we see, the ultimate frame we need to address is the limitations imposed by society itself as social justice is eroded along with our landscape, and as challenges arise to exhausted notions of art and its functions. There are cracks in the walls, though. I like Tim Collins' alternative. Consider the term interface as an analogy for art, a common boundary, the interconnection between systems, concepts, environment, and people. And that finally is it. Thank you for your patience.
You said something in the beginning about the relationship between imagination, reality, and action, and I missed the last part of it. I wondered if you could, if you have any ideas about it now, even if they're different.
I don't remember. Once I write something, it's down and gone. It's out of the brain completely. Well, I mean, I think you could make up all kinds of things about the relationship between imagination. What was imagination, action, and reality? I mean, they're all obviously completely related. You have to imagine something before you think about acting. Reality is usually what you're acting upon. Whatever reality is, of course, is up for grabs. One person's reality is clearly different from the next person's reality, and so forth. But, I mean, I think all good art is a combination of the three. I know a lot of good art doesn't think about action, but I think it's in there somewhere, hopefully. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but.
I guess I was wondering, you were talking about the claustrophobia that an artist might feel that feels some kind of resonance with social justice and wanting to like tie that into their work, and the claustrophobia they might feel in the fine art world. Have you seen the work of J.R.? He just won the TED Prize, the TED Award.
No, I'm very out of the loop. I live in
That's
this
okay.
tiny village.
Right, no, totally.
Don't keep up with stuff.
I guess I was just wondering, my question is, do you see a chance for those things to kind of tie together? Is there a chance of reconciliation? Can you, is it possible to take fine art to the masses, or does it just?
Well, I don't know. The masses is kind of an outdated idea. Right. I mean, the masses as such is just everybody, and not everybody likes the same stuff and so forth. But I do think it's possible, and I think a lot of people are doing it, I mean, it's being done all along. There are always people getting art out of the art world, but of course we don't know much about most of them because it is out of the art world, and consequently we don't necessarily hear about it. So that's one of the problems. I don't know quite what you do about that, but I know artists who've done, are very satisfied with working where they're working and having some effect and so forth. And then there's some of these people also have effect. I mean, Shubhankar Banerjee's images of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge were used in Congress and did have an effect in having them not drill it at the moment. I mean, it's still threatened, heaven knows. But he was having a show at the Smithsonian at the same time, and the Smithsonian immediately moved his show to the basement and took the captions off. So no good deed goes unpunished, but it's, I think I hope anyway, that there's an awful lot going on out there. As I say, I'm really out of the loop. I work very locally now. But I get glimmers from all over the place, and people are always saying to me, haven't you seen so-and-so or such and such? And I don't know JR at all. I assume, since I don't really do much on the internet, but I'm assuming that all of this stuff is out there somewhere in cyberspace, and that if you know what you're doing, you can find it. I don't know what I'm doing, and I still love to read and walk. So I'm not glued to the computer screen, but I'm sure if you were, you'd find an immense amount of really great stuff out there. Now, what happens to that stuff? I mean, if it exists, there's the reality imagination thing again. I mean, if it exists and it affects people, then it's doing its, one hopes what the artist wants it to do. But if the artist needs some kind of reinforcement, or God forbid, some economic reinforcement, then it has to go into another level. And that's the part that the art world is always, it's problematic. And I don't know what you do about that. I mean, somebody over here, sorry. Elizabeth.
Lucy, thank you. The sense is, to build a little bit more on this commentary, it's really interesting to know how these artists do, in fact, create a sort of environment for each other, as well as for those of us who gaze at the work. And how effectively do the means that are now at the disposal of these artists work to have them know of each other and to make accumulating set of statements from these various and diverse sources. And I wondered if you knew anything about it. I heard what you said about living a little bit off the grid, and I heard what you said about there's an internet to be browsed by all of us, et cetera. So if I'm being redundant, you can just skip this question, but I'm really curious about this, an environment that's provided by these artists for themselves and for each other.
But there again, I mean, I'm the last person you should be asking about this, but I curated a show on climate change a couple of years ago, and I never finally figured out where some of these artists were from. I mean, Europeans go across borders so easily that they no longer, I mean, the death of nationalism would be a wonderful thing. But they are supporting each other. They seem to know what each other are doing and everything. I just don't. But I think, I mean, this whole idea of collaboration being collage, to me, that, and Elizabeth, who asked this question, organizes the Native American Film Festivals for NMAI, and is also, was a member of the Heresies Collective, which I was. And so this was in the 70s, we got together. I mean, and it was one of the most inspiring times there's several of us in the audience, but one of the most inspiring times because we did support each other, and I found that with a lot of brainstorming, my work went way past what it would have done if I'd stayed home at my desk. I mean, a lot of self-crit, feminism specializes in it, which I hated at the time. At the end of every meeting, we got together and bitched and whined about what everybody had said. But at the same time, it was often fairly supportive criticism and so forth. But that collective impetus, I think it seems to me there are a lot of young collective people working around. I mean, and again, I always go blank on names and so forth. Ethan, stop taking pictures. And yeah.
First of all, I want to acknowledge I think you're one of the greatest thinkers on art that we've had in a long time. But my question is, do you see people coming up that are doing the kind of writing that really excites you? You mentioned Nato Thompson, whose writing I like too. Are there other people that you find really intriguing?
I really hate naming names, Aviva, I'm sorry, but I never can think of the names that I really would have liked to have mentioned and so forth. And I don't read much criticism, I have to admit. Criticism, as I said, has never really interested me much. It's the art that interests me. And I'm lucky enough to enjoy writing about it, but I don't read criticism for criticism's sake. So I'm sure there are millions of people out there whose names I would forget if I started listing them, so I won't. And some of them are in the audience, no doubt. But I'd rather read about the subjects, and as you obviously noticed, I sort of use the art to not so much back up what I'm doing, but to parallel what I'm doing. And I think I've probably always done that, for better or worse. I think there much better art critics. I don't see myself really as an art critic around who really know how to, I did know how to look at art at one point many years ago, in the 60s, how to really look at something. And when I go to, Harmony Hammond is a good friend, I go to a studio with her and I see, you know, how a real artist who has taught all her life can really look at things and in such a productive way. I can't really do that. As you see, I'm sort of off on my own little tangents and rants and so forth.
So you use the term cultural worker in one of the points in your lecture, which I really enjoyed, by the way. Thank you very much. This might be a little bit off topic, but I'm just curious that if you have any opinions of how cultural worker and like sort of new social and economic work is changing with the influx of new technology and social media, and if it's sort of jeopardizing what the sort of individual can contribute when everything becomes a collective or more mainstreamed or more, you know, glossied over, where many become one. If there's, I don't know if you have any opinion about that.
Well, that's not really happening. I don't think any real danger of collectivity taking over the art world yet. But cultural worker is something that we on the left have always used. I mean, the Art Workers Coalition in the 1960s, late 60s, was about cultural workers because we got, I mean, you get sick, as somebody who hangs out with artists, I get sick of the idea that artists aren't working. The mother of somebody I was with at one point said, well, I don't blame you for leaving because he never worked. But he's a wonderful artist. So that irritated hell out of me. And so, I mean, we're working. I mean, people, I think, don't think, they think I don't know what they think I do when I sit home in front of my computer all day, but I am indeed working, and it is cultural work. And I love that phrase. I mean, I wish we used it more often. Artist is fine, you make art, but there's so much going on now that is over that edge, I think, of people who may or may not even want to be called artists, as I sort of vaguely raised in the photography situation. But we are working, and we're working in a cultural medium, a cultural arena, and I just enjoy that. It's a very lefty phrase. It's not something the art world is going to pick up on a lot. But I don't know about this. The rest of it I didn't quite get, so I better not bite into it. I think art is changing. I mean, it's hard to see it if you're right on top of it, like I suspect most of us are. But it is something different is going on than used to be, and I'm sure it's the technology. I don't know what else it would be. I mean, the economy is part of it. I mean, every now and then I get students who say, you know, well, I can't get enough grants to make my art. And that really irritates me because I think, you know, if you really want to make art, you can make it out of stuff in the gutter. I mean, and people have done that for centuries, or at least decades, a century. And I mean, that just seems to be a very poor excuse for not doing anything. I think the art world has gotten very used to having too many grants. I mean, the alternative spaces used to be alternative spaces. Now they're sort of granted up, and there's not a whole lot of real alternative in the sense of finding a new venue for art and so on, except for the internet, which I'm just obviously kind of not up to. I mean, but I don't know what I have against websites, artist websites, because I'm always going to them now and everything, but I think it's just the screen. I'm not a screen person. I like to see things either in a book where I can handle it or else in the flesh, preferably. But that's strictly my own problem and has nothing to do with the general. I just sort of see what's up. I mean, I spent this morning sort of partly over on the Lower East Side, and most of the things I wanted to see were not open. But it was great to be over there again because I remember various waves of Lower East Side stuff. I want to go to the International Center for Photography. I went to the new museum. You know, it's just whatever. I'm not, art history is not really, I mean, I've sort of done art history, and I don't care about going seeing the German Expressionists, but no, it's not anybody's particular curatorial thing. Of course, if somebody's interesting, I'd like to see it. I want to see Luis Kamnitzer's show at the Museo del Barrio, but it's friends and, you know, just private associations, really, more than anything else.
You talk about being off the grid and the real art world as opposed to the other things that you're showing us images of. It seemed to me. And I've recently seen you in 2 films, one of which I reviewed recently on WAR, the Women's Art Revolution with Mary Beth and all kinds of people, and the other one is the Heresies
Yeah.
Film. And what I wanted to ask you is, do you think that art is most effective when it's a polemical art? Or is there such a thing for you today as art? I hate to use art for art's sake, so I won't, but the idea of art that is not polemical.
Yeah, I mean, I like art. Obviously, I've spent my life
Yeah,
doing it, and I
clearly.
look at a lot of different kinds of art. I love seeing people do new things with images and objects and so forth. At the same time, I mean, I always get this stuff. I mean, you know, people used to say, "Oh, everything you show is so angry," and so certain things interest me, and artists make their art about what interests them, and I'm writing about what interests me. I mean, it's not like I hate any other kind of stuff. I mean, you know, I look at whatever comes by, but this is what I prefer to write about because it's my passion. So that's really, I mean, I like polemical art. A lot of people don't. I do. So, and I've spent a lot of time writing about it. So. There are, God knows, plenty of people writing about non-polemical art, so I don't have to do that. So, I'm always surprised about what people can do with whatever they're doing. So I wouldn't like to pinpoint it and say I only like this and I only like that. I do like some kind of context. I mean, that because of the stuff I'm thinking about and writing about, if I see a picture of a field, I've got to know what's going on in that field, or it's just a field. It might be a very beautiful picture of a field. That's just not kind of where I'm going. But that doesn't really answer that, but I don't know quite where else to go with it.
Thank you so much for the talk.
Oh, there you are.
I wanted to push you a bit on the impacts of photography and the degradation of the planet. And I thought a good way of doing it might be to ask what sort of strategies did you have when you put up that show 2 years ago that you just talked about concerning culture change? What's specific, some of the images you used, but what was going on in your head? How were you
Climate change.
to teach us
Yeah.
something? Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, as I said, what goes on in my head is not, not very methodological. I mean, one thing leads to another really is my methodology. I mean, I decided, I was asked by a friend to do a show on climate change in Boulder, Colorado. I resisted it because I didn't want to do a show again. She made me do it. I did it. And then I went to the artists and the artists that I knew were working with this kind of imagery and this kind of ideas and so on. And then artists always tell me another person to go to. That's how I really find out about things. Well, Shabankar Banerjee's caribou images were in there. Aviva Romani did an incredible, Aviva, I can't explain your piece on trigger. Tipping points of climate. I mean, there were a lot of different things. One of the ones that I find easiest to talk about, because a lot of them were very complex, and one of the ideas of that show was that artists worked with scientists. And most of the artists did on one level or another, and Boulder is the home of all kinds of scientific, governmental scientific institutions.
Take something very mainstream like An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. What would you think about some of the images which I guess have become fairly well-known and archetypal, melting glaciers and
Yeah.
stuff like that?
Well, this
I mean,
was a
what would
little-
be your reaction to that, and why?
Yeah.
Huh?
Well, this was a little less obvious than the Al Gore things, I mean, which is wonderful in that context. This was an art exhibition. There were 17 or 19 or something outdoor public art pieces all around town. One of them was Mary Miss's piece where she worked with a hydrologist to measure where the flood would come once the glaciers melted, the Arapaho Glacier being the source of Boulder's water. And she put these blue discs, they were actually paint can tops on trees and along the creeks, on the high school door. And so you got a sense of where you would be if the deluge came, sort of. Another one that was indoors was the Harrison's piece. I can never remember the title of this thing, but it was about wildflowers going up the mountain as the climate gets warmer. Things go up because it gets warmer and warmer, and then when they get to the top, they have no place to go. which seems to me a marvelous metaphor for the entire problem of climate change, because what happens when we get to the top and there is no place to go? We jump off or whatever. So there were a lot of very different. There were Greg Cholette and Janet Koenig did a piece about how computers affect both the climate and our own bodies, and these were big, lumpish, ugly kind of computer piles of computers wrapped in shrink wrap that were outdoors. That maybe somebody else did a thing about your carbon footprint with local people. This was also outdoors, local people's portraits, and they were asked questions about what their carbon footprint was, and so forth. I mean, there's an awful lot of different stuff. And we didn't have much in the way of polar bears. Although there was a certain amount of ice in this show, a lot of very inventive uses of ice. And somebody said, this show is about global warming, it's all cold. You know, it's all about cold. But it had some lovely stuff in it. And I think it really, I don't know how effective. I had a questionnaire that I handed out, that the museum people handed out, and it was supposed to, you know, I was going to find out which pieces were more effective. I was all excited about getting these questionnaires back, what people liked most and so forth. And the responses were kind of uninteresting. I mean, they liked this picture or that picture, but it didn't say like, oh my God, my carbon footprint will change because I saw this and so forth. So, so much for that.
I have a question about your definition of the photograph. And I wanted to bring in maybe a conversation about the human rights discourse about photojournalism and Ariel Azoulay's definition of the photograph as being an image that's fractured or fissured or obscured or questionable. And I wanted to sort of hear about what you think maybe the agency of a photograph has today.
Well, like I say, I'm not a theoretician, although I admire her writing. I don't know where to go with this kind of question.
Sorry. I'm taking a class with Thomas Keenan at Bard, and we're talking a lot about the boundary and photography without borders, and so I've been interested in how the photograph can function in various realms.
Well, when I talked about that, I was thinking about Susan Meiselas, who had a show at ICP not recently, about 2 years ago or so. Because she has had her, as a photojournalist, she had her photos of Nicaragua miscaptioned and totally turned around politically. I mean, I can't remember what the exact one was, but they said showed that people in Nicaragua were starving and they were all lined up for something, and that was entirely not what was happening and so forth. So as a photojournalist, your agency is diminished in a sense, because it can be put in any place. And the same thing goes for art. I mean, obviously, David Wojnarowicz's Fire in My Belly, you know, was totally misinterpreted, and the administrators fell apart and didn't protect art and so forth. So it can happen within the art world as much as it can outside, but I think photojournalists have a rougher time of it. I mean, once they are paid for their image, off it goes. And I mean, I find the same thing that a few times I've written much for newspapers is, you know, they write the headlines. The goddamnedest headlines come up on something that you're writing, you know, and you think, you know.
But what about people that are trying to kind of subvert that or turn the camera towards the spectator rather than the action itself, or that what happens? Like, I mean, Tom Keenan just talked about this exhibition that he did in Spain called Anti-Photojournalism, and it sort of highlighted the photojournalism in the classical sense and how people kind of turned around and photographed the apparatus, like the making of the, you know, the conflict.
That's interesting. I don't know about that show or whatever, that work, but
it's a small show.
It's certainly, I mean, you know, there are a lot of, the whole notion of who should be photographed and who has a right to people's images is a fascinating one. My partner wrote a book on Navajo photography, in which I would say his message was, I said, you didn't need to bury 300 pages and do years and years of research on every photograph of Navajo. You could just say white people should never photograph anybody else and let it go at that. But I mean, that is, I think, a message that is extremely important. I mean, do we have the right to our own images, and that whole business, and where they draw the line between what is it, if you're a celebrity, if you're a public figure, your image is up for grabs. If you're not a public figure, I mean, who's a public figure? I mean, how in the world do they figure that one out? So I think that's all a really fascinating photographic, strategic thing to look at.
Hi, I really enjoyed your lecture, and I just want to thank you for it. Hi, I'm right here. And I have a question about the human form in a lot of the images you showed. And you know, I've just been thinking a lot about Hannah Arendt at the end of the World War, you know, and images of the Earth, and this anxiety about images of the Earth from outer space, and this kind of sense of scale, seeing the world, you know, as one entity as opposed to seeing the human bodies on the world's surface. I was wondering how you felt. I know you said it gets more complicated when the human form is in these images of the land and landscape. And I'm thinking a lot about this anxiety between, you know, the landscape, effaced of the human body, and just seen as this kind of global entity. And so I guess I'm just curious for you, for the human form, and you know, the point of perspective at which you see the human form in the land and in the realm and in a site and space, you know, how that really changes the relationship of the human body. And
Yeah, I think that, well, I don't know about the relationship with the human body, because that, I think, is something that you experience in the landscape that would be awfully hard to photograph. I don't know quite how you do that, and I'm not an artist. But the single human in the landscape, the sort of Caspar David Friedrich image of one little figure and how vast the landscape is and how small humans are and so on, that's become such a cliche. I love the Bredernitz photo of her little girl looking at a diorama in the Museum of Natural History. I mean, I think that has the startled antelope or whatever they are, you know, that has a lot to say about what you're talking about. But I avoid humans in a lot of stuff primarily because of this this problem that I have with people's images, and how people are terrifically exploited by photographers so often. And you know, and some people might not mind, some people might hate it. I don't know.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.